direct response to modernism. They felt that modernism was getting a little too, what they would call like fancy, where they were trying to make all these big connections, but in the end, postmodernists felt that modernists were just doing it for their own personal story. So today we're going to be looking at what happened after the postmodern movement, whether it's a continuation of it or a reaction against it. So there's our classic modernist architecture, and here's our classic postmodernist. So what this new era is trying to do is they're taking them, they're just putting them together, but what they're taking is the forms of modernism and then the precedent analysis or the historical analysis that postmodernism has. Because remember, modernists ultimately reject the past. Anything that has to do with history, they don't like it. They want to do things from scratch, completely new. Whereas postmodernists do like to look at history a lot, to the point where it can become really cheesy, like an Italian pavilion. And what they rejected about them was the rhetoric for modernism and the extravagance of postmodernism. So by the rhetoric, remember, modernists believed that they could reinvent the world and have this vision, their social agenda, reform. And then postmodernists believe that you have to be extravagant, over the top, and almost, again, just really cheesy in order to get the point across, in order for it to be accessible to everyone. So in this new era of modernism, which we call Neo-Modernism, uses the form and the precedent, but you leave aside that idea that you're going to change the world with the building, and you also leave aside the ugliness, if you will, of postmodernism. And so what we get is this really beautiful blend where we don't just have the classic modernist forms, but we also have the respect for the heritage and the history of the site. So as a just general definition, Neo-Modernism continues classic modernism, which is that 1920s, 1930s era, and then it rejects the ideology that the past needs to be ignored. So they are directly responding to the history of the site and what happens, but they do reject the ugliness that postmodernism tried to make from it. So, your first question says, modernism is to Renaissance as Neo-Modernism is to. So if you recall, when we talked about the Renaissance, there was early Renaissance, high Renaissance, and then Mannerism. And then modernism has a kind of mixture of these things going on. So obviously, our early modernism is the same as our early Renaissance. Postmodernism is kind of like our Mannerism, and then it flips in that Neo-Modernism is like our high Renaissance, right? If that makes sense. So what we mean by that is, remember, high Renaissance was when they had figured out the complete orders, they had revised certain texts, they were experts at how to correctly make classical architecture at that point. And so they just kind of copied it, and they gave it this, higher meaning. In the same way, Neo-Modernism at this point has figured out how to make correct classic architecture. They fully understand it, they can look at it from a distance, they can replicate it, but they can give it this higher meaning. So we're going to be looking at some work by Richard Meyer. He is the same architect as Getty in LA. You've never been there. So this is his Douglas house. It oversees in Lakeland, Michigan. It's a really beautiful home. We look at it, it does have these bright modernist forms, right? It's cubey, boxy, transparent. It's the same materials that the Lord uses in the villas as well. This is the aesthetic section, or the site plan. So the lake is all the way at the top. You can kind of see the sand. And the way you approach the home is this road, and then you have this kind of ravine. And so you approach it at the uppermost level, and then you have these 4 levels underneath it, which go under that bridge. So this is your approach into the house, and I want you, as we look at the different images, start thinking about what his inspiration was. And it wasn't just modernist forms. There's also a very obvious thing that inspired this house. So you enter it here, right? And then there's that big ravine, so that's where the hill kind of comes down. But notice that he is responding to the site. He's not just kind of imposing it onto there, and he's integrating it into the house itself. So the way the house is made is cube, right? Like what LaCour would have done, except LaCour would have probably stuck there. It would have just been a cube on velocities. But then Richard Meyer introduces this plane, right? And then the plane ultimately splits the house into 2 sides, which are the private zone towards the hill on the back, and then the public zone facing the lake on the front. These are display points, program and site, entry circulation, structure and closure, so keep an eye out for those as we look at houses or projects. So when you look at it in section, this is the way it's articulated, right? You have private zone in the orange looking to the hill, so you have nature as a sense of enclosure on the backside. Then on the top, you have a skylight, which creates a light bulb throughout the entirety of the home, because it is a very tall and deep home. Usually you have sunlight reaching all the way to the bottom. And lastly, we have our public zone, blue facing the coast. This is that skylight at the top level. So if you go back to the section, you'll notice it's kind of curved right here. And then there's that deck, so this is that top section. So that's where all the light is picked up. And then it's taken down through the entirety of the home. Notice this big cutout that they leave through it, so the home has this separation between the private back there, which clearly looks very private because it's super solid, and then the public, which is where the image is being taken from. So this is that public zone. All made out of glass, steel, very open. Here's that light bulb, which continues to use the bottom levels, and then our private zone is hidden behind that screen wall, which we saw in part T. Fireplace, which is the only solid piece. So again, we do see that there may be callbacks to history, but they're not doing it in a cheesy way where it looks like a Disney kind of chimney place. It simply is a prominent chimney place. There's the outer deck, so again, public. His floating staircases are very iconic, Richard Meyer, so he's defying gravity, he's showing us a little bit of the structural and technological innovations that allow us to do that. If you recall, in a lot of corps, you did have to put a support under that landing, but at this point you can make it completely floating. We do have details like this, which are a pretty big hint to what the inspiration for the home was. And then this is the interior. Overall very white. He does use a lot of panels on this, and then eventually in his public architecture, he does use these panels of metal, which align with everything. So if you go to the Dead Center in LA, which I highly recommend, especially over winter break, is really nice. You'll notice that every single line aligns to something else. You won't find anything that doesn't align to the rest of the building. It's really incredible. You try to find something and you just can't. And then this is a little bit more of that public zone. Does anyone want to take a stab at what the inspiration was for this one? Yes? Yeah, it was inspired by the ship because it's out on Lake Michigan, which does have a lot of freight going through it. Richard Meyer did take inspiration from that, and I think we can see it a little bit more, especially with the way he designed that light bulb, right? So there is historic inspiration behind it, right? He's referencing the site and the fact that there are a lot of cargo ships and just transportation on this body of water, but he's doing it in a way that's not immediately in your face. Like if this was a postmodernist house, it would simply look like a big boat out of stucco. But he's combining the two, the elegance of modernism with the essence of postmodernism. There's another museum he has, the High Museum of Art in Georgia. So in this one, we can see the element of circulation is the most prominent part out of these two things. So you enter right here onto the second floor, and then you can go into the basement on this level, but really you're going to enter on this upper floor. Notice that he does frame that for us, which is a very classic Richard Meyer type of language. He does like to frame and create portals, so he directs our views where he wants them. So if you do go out to the Getty, you'll notice that he has these frames, and if you go to the rooftop, he kind of frames this is LA, this is the ocean, this is some other landmark, so he pays attention to the site in order to frame it for us. And the entrance, he does frame it. I forget what exactly the thought process was for it, but notice that it's not just straight out onto the street or balcony, but it is kind of at an angle. So basically, the museum is going to be a composition of different squares. Some people say it's 5, other people say it's 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the 6th one is over here, which is the auditorium. So the auditorium is separated from the rest of the museum, so that you can use it independently, so that you can mark it as its own thing, so that you can separate it acoustically from the rest of the museum. So functionally, it does work to separate what it looks like in section. So that big round rotunda section is a huge skylight, just like the Douglas house, and then all of that you see inside of there is a series of ramps. So the circulation, you'll notice, he does mark with the same style of railing that you used in the Douglas house, except now, notice that it doesn't have that same ship-like look, right? It's simply a nice clean railing. So it shows us just how meticulous the Douglas house was in comparison, where yes, it does have that precedent to it, it's not super obvious, but when you look at it in comparison to this, you can begin to see it was a little bit different, and it was inspired by a different concept. So you basically meander throughout this ramp, you go up onto one level, and then it takes you back up and takes you to a different level. I'm going to show you a walkthrough just so you get a couple of different glimpses of what the museum does. But again, you can see this kind of grid is what marks the circulation. So that is also a form of orientation. As you're walking throughout the museum, if you happen to get lost and you see this pattern, you know that there's going to be some kind of circulation through which you can escape through if you see that pattern. The upper galleries, notice, kind of project into that space. So rather than just having art on the wall and leaving that as a big open baluster, he does create these galleries that protrude into this atrium space to capture some of that daylight, but also create a sense of freedom as you walk through the gallery. I'll show you. So if we go into the museum, he does very cleverly use skylights, glass blocks, different materials to allow the maximum amount of daylight with no direct sun rays. You never want direct sun in the museum because it does ruin the artwork. You always want diffused daylight. So right away, you can see this is a very kind of opaque glass that he uses to let lights, and do notice that it is an entire light well. Let's go back this way. Right, so the light well doesn't extend all the way down, and then it does go up as well. So it does go down to these levels, like the Douglas house. Then if we turn around and we go to this space, notice how he frames this statue here with glass block, and it's right up against that light bulb, if you will, and so it's kind of like illuminated. And we allow the daylight to come through, but it's still a sense of partition. So you still get a whole separate space here while allowing the light to come in. He also allows it to come in through the top. So he's really masterful at creating a sense of space without blocking out light. You go into this area, you'll notice all of the floating galleries. So this is what I mean, and this is one of the things he also does in the Getty if you ever visit. You'll notice that he has the galleries, so you can look at them, right? And then as soon as you leave that little space, you kind of get a visual break where you can see, what everyone else is doing, the larger museum, before heading into another gallery. And so it gives you breathing room as a spectator where you don't feel like you're just looking at an endless wall of art or sculptures, but you are having an experience of the museum. You look at a little bit of art, you look at what everyone else is doing, you enjoy the circulation. I'm sorry to bring it up again, but in the Getty, he does it with outdoor spaces. So you go into one block of the museum, and then once you finish that, you kind of head outdoors, and there's this long patio with really views of LA. So you get a little bit of outdoorness, then you head back into a different gallery, you have an indoor experience, and so forth. So it really creates a great experience for a museum because you don't get bored and it doesn't get stale. And there's a circulation which you see leads you very gently into the space and also leads you out into the next piece as well. Very clearly delineated so that we can see where you're supposed to be going. So that's kind of like a summary of Neo-Modernism. I'm not going to show you too many projects because they're all pretty similar, right? A lot of white, a little bit of precedent, a little bit of modernism. I wanted to show you a little bit more high-tech because I do think it's a little bit different. It's kind of interesting, kind of a whole aesthetic, but it does fall under that same umbrella of postmodernism, neo-modernism. Basically, it has a high emphasis on tectonics of construction. So they are trying to really highlight what is the construction of this building, not in the same way that classicism does, where it's a column, it's entablature, pediments, but in a way that is even more kind of like a whole scheme, if you think about it. So this is the Pompidou Center in Paris. It is supposed say is high-tech architecture. This is what it looks like today. So if you look at it in the whole of Paris, there is a high contrast between our beautiful, older Gothic parish churches and then this huge high-tech monolith standing in the center. There was a strong reaction against it in the beginning, just like the Eiffel Tower, but today it is one of the most iconic pieces in all of Paris. The reason there was a reaction is, at the time, in the 1980s, it was believed that if we allowed this in Paris, then we could pretty much make all of Paris look like that without adding an eye, but obviously that was not going to happen. This is the plaza out in front of it, and then this is the stair to get into it. And I want you to take a look at the way they use color in the composition of it. Alright, so there's the structure. We see it's braced on the exterior. Usually these braces are put on the interior of the building or traditionally hidden. So this building does have these braces, but you cannot see them because they're all hidden within the walls. But in this building, they put the skeleton on the outside, which is a really high-tech feature to really show everything that the building is doing on the outside so that you allow more space on the interior to be freed up. That's going to be something we're going to see over and over again. As you get into the building, it's almost like you are a part of the building's functions as well. So kind of like the red blood cells in the Shandigar system, except this is our building still. We're a little kind of piece that's moving through the entirety of the building for these tubes. So circulation we see is very important here, and we really need it as such. And it also creates this really full building experience as well. Now, this is the back of the building, and I told you to pay attention to the colors. So, what do you guys think these are? If this is red, what was the red in the other image, first of all? Yeah, it was circulation. So if this is circulation going up and down, these are going to be our elevators, right? So if you look at the entirety of the Central Pompidou, anytime you see the color red, you know that that's the way you need to get up and down the building. Now, what do you guys think the blue is based on how big those pieces are, the way that they're articulated, what function does the blue have in the building? Yes. So blue is our mechanical system, which you can tell by the size. It's always going to be larger than any of the other utilities. And then the next largest one is the green. So what is the green?
Sewage.
Electrical?
No?
It's like sewage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Plumbing, water.
Plumbing.
So green is our water, and then yellow is our electrical. So as you walk within the building, you'll see them overhead as well. So in this case, we don't really have any, but basically if those track lights were yellow, that would tell us that's an electrical system, right? Or if that little wire against the back wall over there was yellow, that would tell us that is electrical conduit running through there. This is the white. The white is simply ventilation for the underground, which I'll show you in section. So this is what the Central Pompidou looks like. The entirety of it is parking, right? The original site was actually supposed to be this big, and interestingly, this was the only entry in this competition that only used half of the site. So that was one of the things that made it a winning entry, that they allowed all of this for public space so that we did have an opportunity to have outdoor exhibits or outdoor manifestations, etc. Parisians are really big on public space and places to protest. So this was a really big asset to them. And so by using half of it, they did have to go a little bit more vertical, but ultimately need this. Now, because this is so large, you are going to have a lot of exhaust and a lot of fumes. And so you'll notice that because the parking runs underneath all of this, all of those white pieces over there are the ones that are ventilating that underground space. So back in this image, that is what these are, ventilating it from the other side of the site. So every color has a specific function, and so it really focuses you, or it forces you to focus on the tectonics of the building, how it works, how it's put together, how it continues to operate every single day. So you'll notice that the circulation even weaves within it, so that you can touch these pieces and interact with them, and they almost become a part of what makes this a really fun building to even though every building already has this, but really, not many buildings emphasize it like this one does. So if you're inside the first level, there we have our air vents. You can see a little bit of the yellow lining on top as well. Because there is no plumbing, bathrooms, or anything in this area, we don't really see any green, so it's also a way to think about what's nearby. We do see a couple of them over here that are probably running this way. Right? And then look at the way that the structure is emphasized inside of it as well. So the joints are marked white rather than just leaving those as silver as well. And that's this computer center. Now we're going to move over to one that is in London. So this is the Lloyd's building. It's a huge kind of banking insurance corporation that needed a new headquarters. And this building was almost a postmodernist take on high tech, to the point where it does look like a very almost cheesy machine. It is absolutely huge. There is the bottom of it. It almost looks like a factory, but it's actually an office building, right? So again, they are showing us in this piece of Decon of that stair or rocks again and again and again and again. So it almost looks like this huge part of the machine. From the top, this is the entirety of the building, and notice that the circulation is taken out so that it makes those really interesting pieces as we look at it in front of the facade, right? So you could have easily put the circulation inside of that big square and just left it as a really clean outdoor facade, but instead they extract them, they put them out there so that you can see how the circulation works in the building, and they do the exact same thing with the elevators. As you enter the building, very similar room to the computer center, you can have this huge glass canopy that kind of invites you in. It also creates a sense of scale. So one of the big problems with a lot of skyscrapers, early ones, is that they don't give you a canopy like this, which is why, if you've ever seen any film or if you've been to New York, you'll notice that the big residential towers have this like red tube with a carpet coming out to the streets. So that's to give you a sense of scale that's a little bit more comfortable than just straight up entering a 108-floor building all the way up and down. So in this building, it is integrated because they recognize that they were going to have that problem. It's a little bit more friendly and not as imposing on you. There's also a certain problem with the sense of looming. So this happens especially with people that have conditions like schizophrenia and other, like if you have, what's the other one? Alzheimer's. If your building is too vertical, it can almost create a sense of it falling over you, and so it typically scares people. So you do have to create something like this and usually open it up a little bit more so that you don't feel as threatened by the largeness of the building as you enter it. On the inside, we have this huge level, and it still continues to look very highly mechanical. The structure of it, as you can see, is on the outside, right? Or on the inside of the atrium. But then these floors are almost like these plates that you slot into place, right? And it's really articulated so that it looks that way. So once again, they could have easily put this inside of here so that it looks like the plates were being held up by these little columns, but instead they brought the column out so that it looks like these are little pieces that you simply slide into place to create each floor. And then you notice that they leave these floor plates open so you can see the trusses, you can see the structure articulated, and then you can see the people inside of it. So it is a really interesting dichotomy between the organicness of humans and then the high-tech nature of the building itself. This is it from the outside. This is the complete and finished look. So that's the atrium right here, and notice that it is completely unencrusted. It almost looks like a crystal palace. If you remember that from our Industrial Revolution, they were using it in a way that's reminiscent of that. There's our elevators. So as you're standing outside, typically this would be completely covered up inside an elevator door, but instead they left it really exposed. So these are the doors that literally open into the building, right? And then as we move the elevators, and because they're being completely under glass, if you're standing on the street and we were to land on this level, you would get a small glimpse into the building and then it would close back up. So if you're scared of like heights and elevators, Lloyd's building is not a great place to be in. And then from the inside of the building itself, you do have these little portals that allow you to look into it. So it really celebrates and makes it this kind of cool tech element, when in reality, every building tends to have an elevator and it's simply hidden between or behind the doors. Another detail of that staircase, so you are completely enclosed inside of it as you walk, so it's almost like a water slide when you're inside it too, and it really articulates that whole way up. There's a little detail of a facade, so if you look at these are just decorative elements. They don't actually do anything structurally on the outside because that is a bit of a curtain wall right here. And then look at the way that the mechanical system is projected from the building rather than just bringing it straight down or more safely running it inside of it so that you don't have issues with any water. They do roll it out of the building completely. So it almost looks like one of those old computers where all of the wires are coming out of it. So there's really no mystery as to how Lloyd's building works at all. And that's ultimately the goal of my tech. Now another thing that's really hard to capture in images, but I'm going to show you aerially. If you look at all of the blue up here, these are all cranes, right? And at first glance, those cranes all look like they're just there for construction, repairs, but they're actually a permanent part of the building, and they were made blue on purpose so that they look like they're different parts, so that they look like they don't necessarily belong in the building, but really they're there to stay, and what they do is they lower people down to clean the glass on the sides. So you'll notice that each of the little boxes that comes up has their own, so that as it rotates, it can let people come down that specific shaft of the building. The next one we're going to look at is the headquarters of the Hong Kong and Shanghai and Hong Kong Bank, which is this one right here. It's not what's involved, it's this one. Alright, so with this one, as with the last one, the structure is special because it is put on the exterior, so it's a bit of an exoskeleton. You can think about bugs and the fact that their skeletons on the outside and all their soft parts are on the inside. Same thing applies to this building, where traditionally structure would actually be on the interior with a strong core. You would hide the structure and you would have this really transparent glass skin around it. You reverse it in this case. And what that allows you to do is, again, free up the interior because you're not worrying about columns on the inside. Instead, you can worry about how people actually want to use the space. So its concept is these four masts on each side, right? And notice that they have these lines, almost like bridges, these cables that are holding up the building and hoisting it on either side. And so the trusses and the whole structural system is really meant to just hold up the floors vertically, so that there are these little plates that, again, you can slot into place, and you're not necessarily holding them up with individual columns at each level. You're holding them up with a larger exoskeleton. More sections of it. One of the critiques of a lot of these types of buildings is that they have really deep floor plates, and because they try to articulate each floor and the repetition of this so much, their floor plates do tend to be a little bit lower and not have as much daylight. So that is one of the critiques of this movement. You can see a little bit more of that skeleton, and it almost begins to have a human-like quality where it looks like a spine going up and down. Now, one of the coolest parts of this building is that it is completely open on the ground floor. So this is all you have on the ground. You might have a little bit of an elevator over there for accessibility, but you really just have these two big escalators bringing you up into this glass canopy, which is highly unusual for a skyscraper. Usually you have a whole lobby that comes down with a stair and, a really nice entryway, but in this case, you're simply brought up by an escalator. So it's another kind of manifestation of the high tech. You're brought up by a machine into the building. And so, as you stand in this atrium, you can look back down on that ground level because it's all made of glass, and you can see people move throughout it every single day. Here is that escalator coming up right through the glass. If you're wondering about thermal control, basically you have an air curtain where you see this here. So you know when you walk into Walmart and you feel the air coming down on you as you open the sliding doors, that's basically the same thing that happens right here. And so that way you don't have the conditions there leave the place as quickly. And then as you're standing on top, you can look back down and see this, which to some people is like a lot and kind of overstimulating to have all this movement underneath you on every level. You don't really get a visual break from movements in this building. But for other people, it's a celebration of the idea of coming together, of being in an urban scape in a city where there is constant movement, people coming, people going. At the top, we do have these mirrors. So, in kind of the celebration context, you do have daylight coming through here, and then these are mirrors that operate, and they basically angle themselves depending on how much daylight you want, right? So if the daylight's coming from one angle and you want it to be very well lit, you simply rotate them mechanically. Otherwise, you just leave them in place if you don't want too much light inside of there, so it depends. So the building then uses technology to then respond to the site if you want it to. This is the floor plan, and I want you to look at the structure. Okay, so rather than having a lot of little pilotis or little column grids everywhere, it's just these four massive ones every so often. And so all of this is open space with no columns, which is really different from how most office buildings were built at the time. So it allows you for a lot of flexibility. If you want cubicles, you don't have to worry about any, hogging the wood. You don't have an open plan concept. If you ever want to create some walls inside of there, you don't really have anything that impedes you from using that floor space however you want to use it. They do bring out all functions to the ends. So you do have your circulation, mechanical, electrical rooms, bathrooms, plumbing over on the ends over here, and you liberate that whole center space right there. Right? And that way, when you kind of look at the edges of the building, the blank sides, you do have this vertical projection of all the different spaces of the bathroom, floor, elevator, floor. Because they're all different sizes, you can see them on the sides over there. Another example of high tech that's a little bit more sophisticated is the Neo-Modernism Institute in France or in Paris. So it's really the facade of it that's really high tech, super cool. So how it works is you do have these little panels, they are mechanically operated, so you'll notice that they're kind of like these little shutters. So if you want a lot of daylight in there, the shutters open up, and if you don't want any daylight, they close back down. And you can operate them with the push of a button. Or you can leave them to just react to the sun as you will. The issue with them is because they are so tiny and meticulous, they often have issues with some of them just staying permanently closed or open. So they do require you to have a lot of maintenance. But this is what it looks like on the interior. Do you have a better image of it? So this is those shutters from the inside. You can see they're kind of large, right? They're not that small, but they still are very tiny little mechanical pieces. So if one of them just to get ruined, you pretty much ruin the experience. On the other side, because you don't have direct sunlight, you do just have these open glass beams, but notice that they emulate the same grid pattern. They're just left rather plain. So the dichotomy of these two on the interior creates spaces like this, where on the one hand you're blocking out the sun, and on the other end you're allowing to use daylight to come into it. Most of the Arab Institute is a library, which again, those are delicate. They don't tend to like direct sunlight, so you do have to heavily control the facade. In this case, you're only getting some daylight, but notice that it's on the reading side, where the books are not going to be as long, versus on the staff side, it's over on the side with more diffused daylight, where they don't get as much direct sunlight. All right. Another section of Paris we're going to look at is called La Défense. This is going to be their main business district. I'm showing you this just to give you a sense of where it is, how different it looks. So this is the entirety of Paris, right? You see all these little rings of development. If you've ever asked yourself if Paris has skyscrapers, it does. They're just not in the core of it because, again, Parisians are very sensitive to preserving that historic core. So instead, if you look over on this side, you'll notice that you have this interesting little development that is more vertical than anything else in the city. And this is called the Decon, and it is kind of the main skyscraper zone. So anything that's too tall is just kind of shoved in there, so that you have the best of both. Now, if you look at it, it is kind of all posted up on the big platform, right? So look at all the highways that run underneath it. But then notice that they kind of just go here, and they go underneath this huge platform and then reach. So the entirety of it is set up on this multi-level underground parking. So you do have like 3-4 levels of parking underneath all of this. So it is a master plan that does incorporate that, so that every building doesn't have to have their own underground parking, but instead they all share them. So you do need a lot of insulation for that. And at the end of it, we do have what is a sort of abstracted version of the Arc of Triumph, which I don't think we looked at in this class, but it's supposed to be a reference to a triumphal march. Right, so one of the Napoleons created this for themselves, and then they kind of replicated that in a modernist way all the way to the back over there. So we see it's a little bit of modernism slash neo-modernism slash high-tech, in the sense that we do have that historic reference, but we also are doing it in a way that references 1920s, 1930s classic white architecture. And then the high-tech portion you'll notice is this right here. So that is not scaffolding, that is not temporary, that is actually a part of the permanent archway, and so is this. So it has this really nice dichotomy of the neo-modernism with the high-tech side of it. It is absolutely huge. So this is all office buildings on the side. Once again, to emphasize all of these little squares, the drawback is that our floors are really tiny and squished, and because the inside of it doesn't receive as much daylight, we are rather dark as well. This is what that staircase looks like at per scale, so it's enormous. And then this is what they call a cloud. So the cloud is this floating piece of art slash shade canopy, so that as people wait in line to get all the way to the top, they are shaded underneath there. You can also host festivals and other activities down there without it being too overbearing for the offices inside of there. And then these are the elevators. So notice that there are these tiny little capsules. So it picks you up down here, right, underneath the cloud, and then it takes you all the way to the top where you have a cafe, you have a rooftop terrace, and you can enjoy a night out after working at the office all day. Right, so everything you see in this image is not just put there temporarily, it is a permanent part of this piece of architecture. Right, and you can see all of the cables that are holding all of that up. And now, one of the favorites, Decon or deconstructionism, is the last movement that we're going to look at in this class, in part because it is still going on, and also in part because it's the last one that we've actually defined. Everything after that has been this kind of contemporary, and we don't know what to call it yet because we're still kind of in that era. So until we have a couple 20, 30 years, we won't be able to say what the next movement was after this. So we're going to stop with this one, but we're going to look at some interesting pieces. Deconstructivism basically has a super high emphasis on the history of a project site, more than any of the other ones. So although, Neo-Modernism looked a little bit at the site of Lake Michigan with the ship, and then high-tech looked a little bit at the site as far as tectonics go, deconstructivism really looks at the history of everything that we cannot see on the site. So if you guys did not know, there's a little house right there, right across the School of Architecture, called Hostel House. So that was the original School of Architecture, that brown house that's across the street. And eventually we did get this building in the 90s. But assuming you wanted to create something, just for example, that was deconstructivist, you would basically have this building referenced where that building used to be, so that even when that building disappears, it's replaced, it's moved, you would still have that reference to what was there at some point in time. Deconstructivism is the same thing. It looks at old maps very heavily to form connections, so that we in the present can connect to things that were happening at other time periods, even if we can't see it anymore. than just formally, it is broken angles, random angles, because again, they're driven by sights, not so much by the aesthetics or the proportions of it. So we're going to be looking at Frank Gehry, one of, if not the most famous Decon architect. He did start in postmodernism, right? So we have our ugly shapes and pastels, our very obvious cutouts, very Robert Montori-like. And eventually he starts, experimenting with materials. So believe it or not, this is actually a famous piece of architecture. It's a ticket point in Santa Monica where he's experimenting with the idea of chain link fence being a material. So whereas we usually think of that as some kind of throwaway material, temporary, it's not really the finished look, Frank Gehry kept wondering, well, what if we take these materials which are meant to look like finished and rubber on the edges and use them as the finished product? So some people like it, some people don't. But this is a famous piece in Southern California, as is his personal home. So his personal home is super crazy. It was a remodel of an existing house. So it's a bungalow, as you can see right here, the original house. So a traditional, normal run-of-the-mill house, which he turned into this. So what we can see is chain link fence at the top, a little bit of corrugated metal along the bottom. His door is just a sheet of plywood. So it's highly unfinished. It's not really to the taste of everyone. Personally, I don't like it, at least how it looks on the outside. But the ideas are there. He's basically saying, what if we break away from the idea of what architecture has to be, which is use these materials that are meant to look unfinished, we put them in these really interesting angles, and we create things like this, where we create a shell, and you don't even know is that the interior, is that the exterior, is that a veranda, is that a kitchen. So this is actually his kitchen, which he literally pushed out of his house. He created it into this glass box, and the whole concept behind this was, you have a chain link house, a metal house, and a plywood house, right? And you drop them on top of this existing house, they're going to fall apart, which is why they kind of look like cubes, but then the corners are cut off, sliced at their angles. This is the entry, right? So rather than having normal steps, he does create this really interesting cube composition. And then there's his ugly door. Here's an example of where that skin leads to an outdoor space. But in his kitchen, it leads to an indoor space, which you can see right there, right? So what if we create a cube as a ceiling rather than just leaving it flat? He's not so much playing with the idea of site here. This is simply like a side project he has, right? So as he's acting as an architect and trying to convince clients to do things like this, he's experimenting in his own home to get his technique effective. So this is what the interior of the kitchen looks like with that cube overhead. Some of the spaces look really nice, and you'll notice he did strip them of their finished materials. So all of the ceilings are exposed, so you see all of the floor joists, you can see some of the plywood. There's some more of those spaces. And eventually, he does create this. So this is his new home, which you can see is rooted in the same principles, except now he's not using it based on an old bungalow. He's now constructed it from scratch, as he would have liked it to be in that other site. All right, so now we're going to look at some of his actual buildings, not his personal projects. And as you can see, they still have a little bit of Frank Gehry in them. So this is one of his earlier ones. And what he's doing here is he's allowing this corner, which is on the main street, to have very traditional or traditional-ish facade, right, where it has straight up and down, French windows. But even then, he's playing with the bottom skirt of that, where he does allow it to project a little bit and not make exclusion. So he's playing with the idea of the traditional alleyway or walkway having a cover over it, right? So rather than just putting a cover over it, or a projection from the building, he has the building itself kind of splayed itself out, so as you walk underneath here, it is nice and covered for you, and it creates a sense of entrance into those shops. The American Center is supposed to be a place where people from the U.S., expats, can go and they can enjoy a night of theater, they can have galleries, they can basically enjoy being American outside of being in America or in the United States. Right, so notice how that celebrates that entrance, so it gives you a sense of enjoying there. And then on the back side, where we don't have a major theater street, we do have this interesting more sensitive to this kind of stuff, so they do want to keep it on the back side so it's not super apparent. There's a lobby, a theater, galleries, auditoriums. Notice that the entrance over on the normal looking corner brings you in at an angle. So again, he's not just making it straight, orthogonal where it could just come in from the street, but he's putting emphasis on the fact that that is a commercial corner. So he understands that most people are going to approach the site like this, right? And that's a much more natural entry than to walk on a sidewalk, turn 90 degrees, and enter a building. You always want to enter it as gradually as possible. And so he celebrates that in his plan. Some more images. What he's doing with all of these forms, all of these shapes, another canopy. The glass right here, I think this is a small fallback to his actual house. And of course, he's most known for these buildings, which we won't get into this class too much, but these are made with titanium. This is our local one up there, the Brain Center. This is eventually what he becomes known for. He deconstructs these ideas of what a traditional concert hall or clinic should look like, and he makes it into this. Now, one of the critiques that Gary has is that eventually, although Decon is supposed to be responding to the site, all of them look the same-ish, right? So you can't really tell that that one's in Vegas, and this one is in LA, and then that one is in Spain, because they don't really look like they belong there necessarily. The last building we're going to be looking at is the Jewish Museum by Houston. Has anyone here ever been to the crystal shops? So the crystal shops are made by the same architect, so keep that in mind next time you go. You'll notice a lot of his classic moves. The Jewish Museum is really a really great stopping point for this class because of the symbolism that it has behind this. So on the left, we have the original museum, and they wanted to have an expansion in the late 80s and early 90s that would celebrate the idea of being Jewish. Both the idea, because this is Berlin, right, it's in Germany, both the ideas of the Holocaust and the Jews that did not live on to have, a legacy, and to celebrate the diaspora of the Jewish community and their continuity. So he celebrates both aspects within this museum, and if you look at it, it does have this very particular jagged shape that is not something that you just come up with randomly, so all of it does have meaning. And it does begin, I guess it skips another project. So we're going to skip to the bottom. Or actually, let's just go with this one and then we'll come back to the Jewish Museum. Alright, we're going to go to the Parc de la Villette. This is a more fun one. I didn't want to leave this one for that, but we'll go here. So Parc de la Villette is in Paris as well. This one is made by the idea of the points, the line, and the plane, which is the answer to the last one. So in our points, we see all of the red. It is a local park. In the lines, we see our walkways, and then the planes are everything in between. So the concept of the Parc de la Villette is that you're in this huge, expansive park, very much like the English stroll garden. But at the same time, we have a sense of place because each of these, what we would call follies, are individual pieces. So as you go through it, you have a sense of wayfinding. Some of them are interactive, some of them are playgrounds. You can see it a little bit better. So these are some of the paths that they see inside of here. And I'll show you that sense of place within the lines in a second. So this is a partie of what the Parc de la Villette is. So we have all of these little follies every so often along the regulated grid. So on the one hand, Shui's putting a grid over the site. On the other hand, he's responding to the lines that are already there. So this is a old subway line. This is an old canal line, and this is an old subway line that are not actually there anymore, but he's making a callback to the point of the 1880s or so, where they did used to have railroads running here. So he's allowing Parisians to connect with the history of Paris in a way that's very modernist, which the Parisians actually liked. Because remember, the thing that they don't like about all these new types of buildings is that they feel like the history is being erased or suppressed. So by celebrating what was there at some point, they're actually quite happy with this part. These are some examples of their follies. So this one is an information loop. Some of them are little playgrounds, both for children good example of a line and a point come together. So on the one hand, you have this trail, which is very clearly a line, and it's following this existing line that is now from Paris. And then notice that the follies all align along. So we know that one of the grid lines is right here. And then we have that old subway slash railroad line coming in right here. Right? So that one doesn't actually exist anymore. It's just a covered walkway running along here. And where they intersect, notice that we have a folly in the center as well. So every time we have an intersection of this grid, we do have one of these. They are located every so often, so you do have something interesting to do at every point in the park. Alright, so here's the review of it. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 down the line, and then we have some going in this way as well. Because it is a bit of a stroll garden, you do sometimes walk through the follies, under the follies, around the follies. Sometimes there is no walkway, so you have to walk across the plane, which is the big one, into the folly. Right, so it's like a modernist English stroll garden. So it creates a little experience in pictures, but the way in which it's arranged, it's not always laid out for you the way that the stroll garden is. So the stroll garden creates the perfect picture moment, it's hard to go. Park along that allows you to have a little bit more exploration as you walk through it. Sometimes you might run into it on purpose. Sometimes you have to go out of your way to head into, in this case, what is a bar and a folly. It does have a little bit of high-tech on, right? So you see a little bit of the infrastructure running through here, roads, overhead walkways, old infrastructure, electrical components as you walk through it. It does not try to hide the way that the park works in the same way that the English stroll garden does, where it tries to hide the fact that it's all man-made. In this case, you're still looking Alright, so back to the Jewish Museum now. You guys saw the big zigzag. This is a direct quote from the architect Decon. So you can see he's using the Starvated inspiration here, and he does pinpoint where certain people were living during the time of the fascist, Nazi party, where they were hidden, right? And so he marks these points on a big map of Berlin, which is why this star is so skewed and it's not perfect. And his quote is that the museum is supposed to be an experience, some of it foreboding, obviously in reference to the Holocaust. Some of it's inspiring, some of it is full of lights, some of it's dark, some of it is disorienting, some of it is orienting. And that was my intent in creating a building that tells a story, not just an abstract set of walls and windows. So what is he referencing in that last line, an abstract set of walls and windows? Think about original classic modernism, Mies van der Rohe, Corbu, they just create abstracted walls and windows. There isn't really a reason for it to be that way. But in this case with Decon, he is historically looking at where did people used to live, so that the museum then is a reference to all these historical things that happened. And this is what he eventually did with that star. So it's also kind of an abstracted thing. You could have done it in a number of different ways if you think about it. So that's his star. He stretches it, cuts it, squeezes it, distorts it, holds it, and eventually gets the form of what is the Jewish Museum. He also believes that this kind of lightning shaped border doesn't really have a direct orientation to it. It is very akin to the experience of being Jewish in Germany for the entire history of the country, where you don't really know what direction the general attitude towards Jews is going to be. So you have to kind of navigate around it depending on what the culture or the climate is at the time. And then he does create what he calls a sense of void within the museum as well. So the physical museum is, of course, the lightning or the zigzag, and then if you notice, he does have this big kind of line running through it all the way down. And that is what he calls a sense of void and emptiness that runs through the museum. It's not an actual building or a physical component, it's simply an empty swath that runs throughout all of it. And it's supposed to be, obviously, a reference to the emptiness that was left after the Second World War. So the way that you enter it, and one of the big reasons why he won, because this was also a competition, is you have the original museum, right, is a Baroque kind of German palace or institution. You come down through the basement level, and that's when you get into the actual Jewish museum. So rather than coming in at ground level, you do have to come down into the darkest portions to then emerge back into a set of options of what you want to do. So you have the Holocaust Tower, which is right here. So you have this oxymoron along here. And notice that it just kind of ends there. It doesn't really go on infinitely, which is again a symbol of the fact that a lot of things ended during the Second World War. We have the Garden of Exile going down this way, which is also really cool, I'll show you in a second. And then we have our line of continuity, which you see has a set of stairs that lead you into the upper zigzags of the museum. And the line of continuity is supposed to be the actual exhibits where you have all of the different pieces of Jewish art that tell the history of the Jewish community, right? So that underground piece, you'll notice that this part of the building kind of points over here, right? So this is the Holocaust Tower right there, which notice is this huge piece of this concrete, and it does have, if you notice this little line, is a slit of glass where you can allow daylight to come in. Over here, we do have exile, so right here, and then you enter, this is the Garden of Exile. So we're going to be looking at that one first. At first glance, it does look like just the square with these different square pillars inside of it. But once you get closer into it, you'll notice that the interior of that cube is rotating and tilted. And so the foundation of that entire thing is really skewed. And the experience hidden here is supposed to be symbolic of how people felt during the Second World War being Jewish. It was disorienting, you didn't know where to go, and you did feel highly isolated. So you're in the scale of a person, you're about this tall. So you've got these huge pieces above you, especially during the summer when the greenery grows in. You see all of this world above you with greenery, and you're just kind of trying to orient yourself around the bottom. The whole floor is not at level, so you do have to watch where you're going. And it's again a reference to how the Jewish community did have to kind of tiptoe around what was going on with the general German political climate, especially during the Second World War. So this is a model that he made where he kind of laid out those two pieces, so continuity all across exile. And this is the actual Holocaust Tower. So in the Holocaust Tower, again, I told you I have a little light slit. This is the experience that you're supposed to get inside of it. It is completely empty. The whole ceiling is black, so you do have a high contrast of darkness and then a little bit of light at the top. And what he describes it as, for the reason why he designed it in his words, is that it's important to not repress the trauma. It's important to express it, and sometimes the building is not supposed to be something comforting. Why should it be comforting? You shouldn't be comfortable in this world, seeing what's going on around and so forth. So, often in architecture, when we're designing a space, we're told that, again, we have to give it a sense of scale to make humans feel comfortable, because when things are too tall, we begin to feel a little bit smaller, a little bit uncomfortable. And in this case, especially knowing the meaning behind it, it's very appropriate to have that huge sense of scale. It's this big, skinny tower, so probably twice as tall as this, or probably around this narrow. So imagine standing in this really small void, and then just looking up into darkness with a little bit of light coming through. And there's nothing inside of it, nothing is ever meant to go inside of it. It's simply an experience where you stand there, you take it in, and then you walk back the path you came through. Because again, there's really nothing after it. A lot of things just ended here. Now, if you decide to go down continuity, you basically come up from the basement of the stairs. And notice how we have these decon lines running through it. Every single one of these is meaning. I don't know what the exact meaning is behind every single one of these pieces, but then at least it does. And he's probably referencing where someone lived. He does reference where these camera and his daughters lived at the time. I don't know which one of these, but I know he does it in the building. And then as you go through the different galleries, you eventually get these empty spaces, which are part of the void. So if you notice along the top, you do have that line running, and that is symbolic of that void. So as it crosses through the zigzag 1, 2, 3 times, you do get 3 voids. So when you walk through the galleries, you get to look at a little bit of art, a little bit of contemporary, historic art, and eventually you reach these little resting spots. So in a way, it's similar to what Richard Meyer does, when he gives you a little bit of breath of air to It did have an art exhibit installed in 2020, so these were made by kids during the pandemic. I think it was Jewish kids, if I'm not mistaken, and then they created foam masks, so there's 10,000 of them, and then you're supposed to walk over them. So notice that over there is a continuity, which if you arrive at this point and you were to see us on the ground, I wouldn't necessarily know if to walk over it or not because it looks like a permanent exhibit. But again, it goes to show that sense of discomfort that Leaston wants you to experience, where it feels almost disrespectful to walk over the art and all of these masks, especially in the context that it's in a Jewish museum. You don't want to walk over all the spaces, but you're meant to do that in order to experience the discomfort of being Jewish in Germany at a certain time period. You also do have windows, and they all have meaning. I don't know exactly what each one of them is. But from the exterior, you can never tell what floor you're looking at if you're looking at a staircase. If you look at a lot of houses, you'll notice that the